Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Mess. So, we're going to have a super fun and super exciting episode for you guys today, because it is a follow-up to the Super Mario 64 ported to PlayStation 1 video. That video did a ton of views, and I had a lot of questions and comments on just how this was possible, because people thought that you could never actually run Super Mario 64 on the PlayStation 1, because how do you run a 64-bit game on a 32-bit console? So we're going to be getting into a lot of the technicalities and artistic things behind how this actually works, and settling some of those actual playground arguments back in the day as to what system was technically better. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. And just so you know, most of you had issues trying to actually build this, but now on the GitHub page under releases, there is a patch that you can patch into the actual game files. That way you could get a playable version of this for DuckStation or for a PlayStation 1 development kit and go ahead and play it yourself. Because I know a lot of times doing Linux or Windows builds off GitHub trip a lot of people up. Even I sometimes have issues with them. But the real question is, how is this even possible in the first place? Because obviously Super Mario 64 was a technical showcase of just what the Nintendo 64 hardware could do, developed in tandem by Nintendo and SGI. This was basically considered to be something that would never work on PlayStation 1, and even though obviously this is not a complete version, it definitely has a lot of room to bit better. It is one of those things that's just absolutely still insane to see. Right off the top, when people saw this, they were blown away that it could even work in the first place. So the reality is, the Nintendo 64 may be a 64-bit system, but that doesn't mean it has to run 64-bit code. Basically, bit and register addresses are not always required to be used. It's one of those things, just because you have the ability to use that upper 32-bit registry, or just because you have extra horsepower that you can employ against something, does not mean that it will be required or necessary for the development of any particular game or project. And considering this was Nintendo's first game basically for the N64, it really isn't all that surprising that they didn't throw everything in the kitchen sink at the game. Because if you think about Super Mario 64, it is an iconic game, the graphics absolutely hold up, and it has a very big sense of charm. But the reality is, if you actually take a look at it, it is definitely one of the least technically impressive games on the N64 compared to a lot of what else came out. And so taking a look at the PlayStation 1 footage here, you will see that every once in a while it is going to hitch, and that is just part and parcel of the fact that this isn't actually a completed project yet. Now, how this was done is obviously Super Mario 64 has been fully decompiled, because we've seen a lot of different PC ports of the game. So having that decompiled source code means you can try to then rework it for a new target platform. Now, obviously, this is what Super Mario 64 is supposed to look like, recently captured off the analog 3D, and I'll be showing you more of that shortly, or maybe I already have. But we can get to this place for the most part on PlayStation 1 with a little bit of technical trickery and with a little bit of smart coding. Well, I say we, I'm definitely not making the port here. That is down to Maldecart, who's done an amazing job, and I think even they were probably surprised just how much press this thing actually got. But the reality is, Super Mario 64 is not a 64-bit game. There are a few versions of it that use a few registers on the 64-bit bus, but otherwise it's basically always using a 32-bit system, which is exactly what the PlayStation 1 is. So the first thing about it is that you can run Super Mario 64 on a 32-bit CPU, because that is primarily how the game runs on N64 as a 32-bit game. The N64, a lot of the 64-bit was marketing, and even though a lot of games did use that 64-bit functionality, it really doesn't need anything for Super Mario 64. It may have been the king of the bit wars, or even if you think about it, maybe Atari Jaguar did that math first, but it does not actually need to use 64 bits, and Nintendo even actually released newer versions of Super Mario 64 to bring those few functions down to 32-bit so that it would actually run better. And don't forget, there are coding mistakes in Super Mario 64 that Kaze has found, because basically Nintendo was learning how to use this hardware in real time. So something like Return to Yoshi's Island, an absolute technical masterpiece on N64, that is also 32-bit code per Kaze on Twitter. So it really isn't a 64-bit game. But remember, you can't actually think about these things as 32-bit and 64-bit. Sure, it isn't a 16-bit game, that might be a little bit too small, but otherwise, something like Super Mario 64 is going to be perfectly able to be run on something like PlayStation 1, because a 32-bit game is going to run on a 32-bit CPU. So basically ignore the fact that the N64 has a 64-bit CPU, because the reality is Super Mario 64 is just running as a 32-bit application, the same way that if you have a retro game on your Windows 10 or 11 PC, that's going to be 32-bit as well, but it works perfectly fine on Windows because it is interoperable. And don't forget, both the PlayStation 1 as well as the N64 have a MIP CPU. Yes, the CPU in the N64 is more powerful, but MIP is an instruction set, which means you really aren't changing the code around all that much. It's technically probably easier to get the code running on PlayStation 1 from N64 than it is to get it running on PC from N64, because MIPS is not the x86 architecture, so there would be less changes. No, I'm not saying it's an easy job whatsoever, I'm just saying that it is something that makes fundamental sense because you're code porting from the same architecture just across to different pieces of hardware, and you're still staying in that 32-bit application envelope. So I am sure in the future when people ask, could this thing be finished? It absolutely seems like it could be finished. It's going to take a lot of work, because even though it's doing this right now, obviously this is not a full Super Mario 64 experience. But now let's talk about the more challenging thing when it comes to an N64 port to the PlayStation 1, is the fact that the N64 has a Z buffer where the PlayStation 1 does not whatsoever. Basically, the way to think of a Z buffer is this: it in hardware allocates exactly where things are supposed to be drawn to the screen, and that allows it to have the depth. So when the castle door is behind Mario, that is all Z buffer. It just basically layers in something like Photoshop, except done in hardware in a 3D space. But to better visually explain it, let's freeze this right here and just loop it a little bit. The Z buffer is basically arranging everything in the Z perspective. So if you go ahead and take a thought at that, it's basically just doing depth calculations to say everything that we have to render onto the screen, this is where it should be rendered correctly. Now it is more complicated than that. There's a lot more than 4 items in the screen, but if you think of the Z buffer, 1 being Mario, 2 being the sign, 3 being the hill, and 4 being the castle, those in the Z buffer are all basically rendered with that priority, so you actually have the appropriate polygons on the appropriate areas of the screen, so that fully 3D realized world actually makes sense. That is not something the PlayStation 1 has as far as hardware is concerned, and while technically you could emulate a Z buffer in software, the hit to the CPU on the PlayStation 1 would be massive, and you'd probably be talking about seconds per frame on something like a Super Mario 64 port versus actually frames per second. Now I don't have the exact math on that, I can just tell you it's a very expensive operation, and if I was doing the coding, and trust me, I'm not because I suck at coding, it really wouldn't be the way I wanted to do it. But even if we take a look at the prototype port here, you are going to see that things are appearing basically in the correct orientation, and that is because even though the PlayStation 1 doesn't have a Z buffer, it has the ability with certain commands in the software development kit and how the hardware was developed to basically trick it into thinking it has about as close to a Z buffer as you can get. That is because it actually has depth lists and other calculations that it can do, so when it's drawing the polygons to the screen, it's going to know approximately exactly at the depth they're supposed to draw them to. Now this is not as good of a functionality as something like the Z buffer on N64, and that is why in certain polygonal models on the PlayStation 1, you will see polygons popping in from the background to the foreground and back again. It is just an imprecise setup, but you'll see here even in this prototype version of the Super Mario 64 PlayStation 1 port, things are basically where they need to be. So this is definitely an achievable task. It's just going to require some work, unless the developer of this Malacart has some secret sauce to be able to actually emulate a Z buffer in software and still have enough CPU horsepower to be able to run Super Mario 64. My guess would be that that is not the case whatsoever, but I never say that something isn't possible because developers surprise me all the time. As we enter into the pyramid here, you can see that things are where they need to be, so this is basically a quasi-solved thing at this point in time. Now it is just a whole lot of work trying to get the code to a point in time where it looks exactly like Super Mario 64 and then runs at a decent speed, because I will say right now obviously it is going to hitch here and there, but it is still pretty impressive. And again, that is why you see on PlayStation 1 those polygons just kind of jumping planes. It is imprecise math, and even if it involves a lot of algebra and calculations, it really isn't perfect. Now technically it's called a painter's algorithm. Basically you paint things from the background into the foreground, but it's very similar to what I do in filmmaking all the time. I build a background tune by shot, and then I bring everything I need to show to the foreground. Now obviously this is in real life, it isn't a computer program, so I don't need to worry about Z buffering. We have the physics of the planet that we live on, and the universe all works the same way. But in software you have to kind of play around with these things called ordering tables, and again that is something that Super Mario 64 can work with. All you really need to do is do the math. Now don't get me wrong, it's going to be very complicated math, it's going to be a metric shit ton of math, and it's going to take a very long time, but it is possible. because the reality of the situation is porting Super Mario 64 to PlayStation 1 requires porting 32-bit code to a different 32-bit CPU that uses the same instruction set and dealing with the lack of a Z buffer. Those are achievable things to overcome, and honestly in the code port it really isn't anything to overcome, it is just doing the work. And even though you're obviously going to get the PlayStation 1 look at a Super Mario 64 with some of the polygon wobble if you don't use DuckStation, it's going to have exactly what you want. Super Mario 64 gameplay, Super Mario 64 music with the aesthetics of something like the PlayStation 1 graphics, and honestly I think that's going to be an absolutely fun vibe that a lot of people are going to be here for, because honestly the first video did a metric crap ton of views, at least for my channel, so I know people are hungry for this one. So if you're ever wondering back in the day those arguments that Super Mario 64 wasn't possible on PlayStation 1, Malacard is quickly proving to everyone that that in fact was not the case whatsoever and it can be done. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.